welcome to the Nirvana Strength Practitioners panel, where we focus on the idea of human performance optimization, which we define as the process of applying knowledge, skills, and technologies to improve and preserve the capabilities of humans to execute essential tasks. This is always quite a mouthful when I say this. So generally, as listeners, we welcome you to join us on this exploration of how do we optimize the human body, not just for health, fitness related things, but also really anything that you're working on, whether it be relationships or work or whatnot. It just kind of happens to be that today we are going to focus on health, and in particular anti-aging and regenerative medicine. Okay, and so today's guest is with Dr. Laurena Law. She is board certified by the American Association of Anti-Aging and Regenerative Medicine and is an advanced fellowship in anti-aging, metabolic, and functional medicine. Also a mouthful. Yeah. Would you say that every time you're like, I do all this stuff? No. Okay. But I also find too, particularly interesting is in addition to your clinical practice, is working as an educator, right, and presenter on a lot of public topics, and some we'll discuss today with regards to hormonal health, fat loss, nutritional supplementation, detoxification, stress management, integrative approach to aging, skin, and intravenous use of I like this idea, the idea of using intravenous fluids. And then also she authored the section on intravenous therapy in the book Strength and Conditioning for Combat Sports, which I think is also quite relative to what we do at Nirvana Strength with regards to performance training and how it would benefit there. So today we're going to focus on anti-aging and regenerative medicine, and really I guess anything that kind of falls underneath that, which really is kind of everything, I think, right? For the most part. I mean,
it is.
Yeah.
It's actually everything, and it's quite overwhelming in many ways. But the reason why it interests me and why I kind of find myself going in full circles in all aspects of health and wellness is because I started out in general practice. So in Australia, we call general practitioners a jack of all trade. So you pretty much have to know all different diseases, conditions, and presentations because you're a gatekeeper for a lot of these issues. So that means you kind of have to treat the basics first, and if people don't stabilize or they don't get better, then you've got to work out when you have to refer to a specialist.
Right. So we were just talking before about the idea of anti-aging, and if someone were to ask you what is the study of anti-aging, is it just trying to find essentially like the holy grail of holy grails, right? To stay young.
Yeah, it's actually not a new concept, and I have to sort of go back to my roots into China, because the Chinese people have had 3,000 years of medical research and documentation about how to live well and how to have good quality of life, how to sustain vitality. And so I think this anti-aging term sort of in a Western culture is kind of a little bit newer, because some of the technologies and advances in medical science has kind of brought to attention that it is possible to not just prolong life, but also to improve quality of life. So I guess anti-aging to me, I kind of use anti-aging, proactive aging, optimal wellness kind of all in the same basket, because there's so many overlapping principles. So that's why I kind of say, well, anti-aging, everyone resonates with it. And also because part of my practice also involves aesthetics, which means using cosmetic injections such as collagen, such as injectable nutrients, to sort of preserve the external appearance. So it kind of has different definitions depending on which circle of people that you actually talk to. But for me, it's not just external, it's internal as well. And sort of the internal part is really part of my lifelong passion. So I kind of incorporate everything under that blanket.
Yeah. So how would you differentiate like what you focus on now with maybe what other people in the anti-aging community do? Like, is there any parts of what's happening in the anti-aging like community that you wouldn't necessarily like follow, or you feel like maybe you're doing different than what other people are focused on?
I think a lot of people, I mean, it's a very broad area as well. So there are a lot of doctors who are focused on stem cells and regeneration, hormonal therapies, peptides, and also sort of very innovative types of treatments. But it also goes into lifestyle medicine, because really when you look at all these advanced treatments, you still need to, or you would want to, have a very good foundation of diet, nutrition, movement, because what I've observed in my practice is people who have that good foundation, if they do go into or choose to have these more advanced therapies, they tend to respond better, they don't tend to need it for as long a period of time, and they also experience less side effects.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a really, really, really broad study. And do you find that most people in anti-aging, do they typically focus on, like, let's say they just focus on just one part of the whole picture? Or, because it sounds like you have a broad, like, combination of all these different areas, and you try to incorporate everything into your practice. Is it hard to figure out the puzzle? Because I mean, there's got to be so many pieces, and then each individual is like so, like, different, and it's got to be. I mean, interesting, because it is like a continued like puzzle, right? And it's like a new puzzle for every single person that comes in. But is it at times frustrating, the process, or?
It's challenging, because it's a very different paradigm to where I started, which is in conventional, traditional, like conventional medicine. Going through medical school, and then you go and you choose your hospital medicine for a while, and then you choose your own specialty, and you just focus on that. So in anti-aging, there's also that pathway as well. So there are certain doctors who just focus on sort of, say, hormone therapy, or just stem cells, or perhaps even sort of the regenerative side of it. But because it's so broad, I can't actually do everything, because it's just too time consuming to learn everything. So my position usually is, I find out who those people are who are really, really good at what they do. They do this every day. That's their bread and butter. And then I find the right person, the right patient who would be suitable for that particular treatment. So I'm still kind of doing my family physician general practice role, but I understand more a bit about the actual therapies that are available. And so for me, my focus is on just really doing the basic things well. So sleep, diet, movement, stress management, being connected with yourself, and also understanding how our changing environment is affecting our bodies.
I think that's a really very important and good point that you bring up with regards to focusing on the kind of the most basic components of health. I think, like, so many people are so quick to want to start taking pills and want to start taking supplements and trying to figure out a quick and easy way. And then I mean, I'm sure, like, some of the basic questions you'd probably ask is just be like, are you sleeping, right? Are you actually are you eating whole food, or, like, you know what I mean, like, just even super basic stuff. And then people tend to, like, so many of the basics are just kind of messed up in their life, and they're just like, they just want like a quick pill to kind of fix everything. Which I think, in a sense, also kind of goes away from the idea of from the business side of it, right? Like, it's really easy to just be like, oh yeah, take these pills, they'll make you feel better. Cost you like $2,000, and then knowing that because their foundational, like, parts of their life are still in a mess, they're more than likely going to come back, maybe even worse than when you fix them in the first place.
totally. And this is really the paradigm of conventional medicine. So when I first studied and went into hospital medicine, and when I started seeing patients, and I started seeing everybody from pediatrics to geriatrics, I started to realize that there was this pattern of old people coming to hospital, and they were already on 10 different medications. And then we actually send them out of the hospital with an extra 5 different medications. So then it kind of, the penny dropped for me, sort of at that point where I realized that we weren't really getting people better. We're just using medication to sort of keep them in this symptom-free state, but the disease process is still ongoing.
Right.
So it's a frustration, because when I first started out, when I said to myself, I signed up for medicine, I wanted to learn about wellness and health, and how do we maintain health, because general practice is about preventative health, and we talk a lot about preventative health, but unfortunately, in the 20 years since I've graduated, it's still very difficult to put into practice for a lot of doctors. Because it's very easy for us to write a prescription, and then the patient goes home. We spend maybe 15 minutes per consultation, and that's to even just explain the side effects and the drugs, and then there's no room left to actually talk about those basic foundational things. And people get used to the idea of just taking a pill, whether it's a drug, medication, or a supplement, even, because either of those things, if you're really just targeting symptoms, you're just targeting symptoms. You're not really looking at how the person got there.
Is it difficult? Because it almost seems like, if a doctor, it seems like there is some kind of like moral and ethical issues with how the system is, right? Like if you're actually in like wanting to help people get better from a health perspective and longevity perspective, like you probably should spend a little bit more time with them than the 15 minutes. Do you find that it's an issue, like a systematic issue, like just with the actual like big hospitals? Because a lot of them are like basically like businesses. The States, right? Like to get an MRI is like $10,000+, whereas in some countries, I know, like I got an MRI in South Korea and it only cost me $100 as part of their medical, their like national pension or national insurance. So I felt like there was definitely, I guess America is kind of the extreme example with regards to costs. How did you get away from what you felt like was like the problem with your general practice?
I think understanding that actually we're working in a system that is only catering for short consultations, and it kind of has a history of coming from medicine that was practiced in the wars. A lot of it is acute medicine. A lot of the things that we've learnt in terms of disease and infections actually came from when we learnt about it in people who had infected wounds. So a lot of the system that we still have today is kind of based around that. It's very much acute care. So, and I actually have to say that we have developed a lot of amazing, great technologies to deal with that, to deal with emergencies, to deal with acute infections. And I think that's a great tool that we have. But now we're not at that kind of war space. We're in a situation where we have plenty of food. We live inside buildings. We often sit at a desk for work. We're tending to use our brains more than our bodies. So we've come and we've evolved into a different kind of life. So then diseases, the patterns of diseases become much more chronic. They're much more long-term. So, but the institutions and the insurances, it hasn't evolved to cater for that. So we're still in a situation where these structures are in place, and they're just rewarding fast acute medicine.
Right.
And we know that it doesn't work because there are still many, many more people getting chronic illnesses.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's amazing how health conscious people are in America, but how we just continue to get in worse and worse condition. Like our health is just getting way worse. We're still our obesity rates are just kind of going through the roof. And it seems like, I mean, there's definitely a lot of health stuff that's definitely driven by mass media, by just private entities. And I mean, what are so you say when you you're going into looking into the research, not necessarily all the research, but you're looking into which individuals you would trust, when you have normal people who kind of want to go through the same process, right? How do you go through your process of figuring out who is someone that would actually be someone that you would listen to and you trust to actually do the research?
Yeah, so it does take a bit of time, but I guess because I come from a background in medicine, in science, and also in sort of critical thinking and looking at research and looking at what people are saying, I often will look at what training they've done on top of just their regular medical training, and then I will look at sort of information that they've written. And then if I get an opportunity, I will often call them or meet them in person if they're in Hong Kong, and sort of ask them about how they practice, what's their philosophy, what kind of patients they generally see, and explain a little bit about the type of patients that I see, and sort of have a face-to-face communication, and just, I guess, suss them out, really.
I think, I mean, the idea of even as simple as asking someone what is their philosophy and how do they decide on the type of treatments for their clients. I mean, I think it's quite easy to just be oh, your thyroid is swollen or whatever, here's a pill to fix that. I mean, from a critical thinking perspective, it's okay, well, that's the symptom of what's wrong, but what's actually wrong.
Yeah.
And I think even that, it's don't be confused with getting a quick fix, right? So they see a problem, they say, okay, you do this to fix this problem, but knowing that the problem that is visible is not, it's just a symptom of the actual underlying issues.
Yeah, exactly. And I often use this analogy about the iceberg, because the symptom is actually just the tip of the iceberg. But what you don't see underneath the iceberg are all the underlying conditions and issues that people have. So whether it's toxins, whether it's detox issues, whether it's past trauma, whether there's emotional problems, whether they're just eating the wrong diet, not moving enough, all those issues are very foundational. And going back to sort of when you asked me how did I get out of that paradigm of just working with fast insurance or symptom medicine insurance-based practice, it took a while for me to set it up. So I started with friends, family, just to see how they would respond to my way of questioning them and asking them. And then as people started to get better, it kind of made me sort of become a bit more courageous in implementing this in my day-to-day. So I would add extra questions to when patients came to see me about symptoms. And I did this for a while, but it wasn't until someone very close to me got really ill, was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, that I realized I have to be quite serious about this, because this could happen to anybody in my own family. It could happen to me, it could happen to people I love, and so I want to know a bit more about this, and I want to be formally trained. And that's the reason why I became board certified, because I needed to understand a broader spectrum of how things are connected. And over time, I would go and speak to different people who are very proactive about aging. So people who are in fitness clubs, PT studios, people who were connected to really empowering the individual. I would just go and just talk about what I do and how I practice, and so just through word of mouth, really.
Is it hard to I would guess that most of the clients and the people that you see, they have some idea, or at least they're experiencing some negative effects of whatever their underlying issues might be. Is there, how do we, I mean, how would you change people's thinking, right? To go away from just dealing with the problems when they arise, right? So how do we get away from health with regards to just the being healthy is, right, essentially the absence of problems or disease, which is what most people think, right? How do we get people to take more of an active role in the preventative, the care, and the actual just dealing with issues before they become issues.
Yeah,
right?
it's
I mean,
challenging. It's very challenging because it's human nature to not deal with anything until you feel pain or you feel any discomfort or you start having symptoms.
Yeah.
It's human nature.
But even some people will they will be okay with a certain amount of pain, right? Like my dad was at some point he kind of just woke up one day and his back kind of hurt a little bit, and then after a week of every morning or 2 weeks or whatever, his back hurting a little bit, like just now it's like it's normal and it's just like whatever, my back hurts a little bit, and then just not dealing with it, or I've had I had one client who thought she was eating extremely healthy because she was eating a lot of whole food, she was eating a lot of grains and all that stuff, and then come to find out that she's like allergic to half of the foods that she's eating because she just can't eat oats or can't eat whatever. So she spent 10 plus years thinking that she was just overweight when she was just really just swollen and just inflamed. Which is kind of funny.
There's a few different scenarios there. I think one thing I've realized is that we accept degeneration dysfunction, sort of pain, because we think we're aging. I think that's part of what we've been told is, it's just age. Or memory, you lose your memory or you forget things. I'm just getting older. That sort of cliche saying, and we just kind of accept it and think, that's just the way it is. But is it that, or is it because there's no pill for it?
Right.
So I'm always, philosophizing about that and thinking about that. But I mean, that has to start with, I think, education, really, from our children and our kids. We're not teaching kids about what is optimal health. Optimal health isn't just about being disease free. Because the WHO, World Health Organization, they have a definition of what is optimal health and wellness, and it is physical and emotional well-being that is beyond disease free. It's actually much more about vitality. It's much more about quality of life. So if we don't know what that is for each of us, and we don't know what that is since we're young, how are we going to know what that is when we're older? Because the only person and I always say this to empower my patients, the best person to know what's wrong with you is yourself. Because you have to live with yourself every day. So
it's that's a tough one. I think we do find that particularly like here at the gym, like when we're trying to figure out where are you having some weaknesses or physical issues with your body, we tend to find that a lot of people, just naturally through their daily lives, actually consciously or not, or mostly unconsciously, they actually avoid all the issues or all the ranges of movement that they have because it's a difficult position, or because it's painful, or because they've had some past traumatic issues that now it's like kind of ingrained in their brain to kind of stay away from this position. I think there is there's definitely a component of life that, and I think a lot of our bodies are kind of built this way, this idea of just survival, right? And we used to be always constantly in nature and forced to adapt to just some obstacle that would arise in life. So like if it just started getting cold, it's like, okay, we got to start doing something to warm ourselves up. But now it's like we're so comfortable in life, right? I mean, in Indonesia, right? So easy just to be like, go Gojek everything, Gojek massage, Gojek. So everybody, Gojek is just a delivery service, and you can get anything delivered, food, massages. You can get house cleaners, you can get whatever, and we don't actually like actively even put ourselves into challenging situations to actually deal with
Yeah.
issues.
It's true, and I think also because we are so afraid of that, and we don't realize that actually our body is an amazing machine that has the capacity to adapt to that stress that we put it through every day. It's just that it's not apparent right now because we're not living in nature. We're not sort of, running away from a saber-toothed tiger or trying to climb a tree or,
Yeah.
So we don't have that ability to test it every day. So it's not immediately tangible to us. And all these things that go on in terms of what's not visible, which is kind of a lot of what I deal with, looking at people's blood levels, hormone levels, those things are not, readily accessible for a lot of people. They don't realize that the imbalance is happening there. And just because they don't have a symptom doesn't necessarily mean that they're well. If you look at a lot of athletes, they might look great, six-pack, everything out on the outside, but they're not menstruating, or their testosterone's low, they're not sleeping well, they're very inflamed, they have high oxidative stress, and it doesn't present itself straight away because that's our body adapting.
Yeah,
so we have great capacity.
Yeah, great capacity to adapt to our environment, but also, I mean, that could, if our environment is not ideal, then it's going to adapt in a kind of a bad way. With regards to like athletes, I find that even like there's a big difference between the aesthetic appearance that what people are actually like wanting to get, right? So your beach body and such, and the physical performance aspect of life, right? So are you wanting to be 50, 60 years old and maybe you're bedridden because you herniated a disc in your back and you can talk about that one time you had a six-pack? Or do you actually want to be 100 plus years old and being actually active? I think the long game is something that is very difficult for people to think about. I think even I can't remember who said it, but even the idea of living until you're 100 years old, there's actually quite a few people that would not want to live that old because their perception of someone who's that old is someone who is around in a wheelchair and hooked up to an IV or oxygen tank.
Yeah.
And they're just like decrepit and about to die
dependent
and so dependent, right? Like, of course, if you're like that, I could see why you wouldn't want to be at that age, but
so this is really what I call it proactive aging, is really about...
Ooh, I like that, proactive aging.
I like that word better than anti-aging, but people always resonate better with anti-aging. Okay. But proactive aging, like, we're in a day where we're not just talking about lifespan, we're talking about health span. So if that's... I looked at that picture when I was in hospital medicine, and I thought to myself, geez, I just want to live until 60. Because I don't want to live 20 extra years dependent on somebody giving me a bedpan. That was not ideal. But if we actually look at a lot of ancient traditional cultures, they're living productive, purposeful lives. The Japanese in Okinawa, they have the highest number of centurions. Yeah. And if you look at the reasons, it's all about being in nature, community, connection, purpose.
I think, definitely all those things are good components of the overall picture. With regards to, let's say, nutrition, do you find that nutritional science is, even though there are some studies out there that have been happening for a long time, that it's still a relatively new field that we're still trying to discover, still trying to figure out?
I think it's...
Because it was not even that long ago where there was a really, like, almost a revelation with regards to, like, gut health and microbiomes, and people actually be like, oh, wow, our guts are actually really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see that about nutrition, because prior to the discovery of, wow, you know, our gut microbiome actually has an influence on how we metabolize our nutrients, all the research was really just based on calories and based on macros and based on how that affects your hormones and training performance and all this type of stuff. And then now, and even after, and in addition to discovering a bit about the idea of genetics, we're discovering that actually there is an interplay between gut microbiome and our gene expression. So then that adds another layer of complexity to nutrition, because it's no longer the calories that count. There are so many other physiological, much more powerful impacts that the food can have in our bodies. It's not just calories, it's actually information.
Yeah.
It's sending signals to our brains, to our microbiome, to our genes. So I think the area of this type of science, and well, I call it nutrigenomics, because it's a study between genes and nutrition and how that affects expression. It's new. It's very, very new. So it's very exciting, but there's also a lot of unknown. And it's very difficult to do the research on it. But I think, you know, I'm hopeful that there are people out there doing the research, looking at this, and hopefully we will really one day be able to quantify what helps people be healthy.
Yeah, I think, I mean, so if let's go back to the idea of the blue zones. I've heard that's even some of that was cherry picked with regards to like which regions were selected as promoting like blue zone areas, and that even there would be even areas like, let's say Okinawa was one of the areas that was highlighted, but that there would be places relatively close to Okinawa that would have a slightly different diet but still have high levels of centurions. Do you find in any of your other research that, because like I think Hong Kong is has pretty high lifespans
very, very
in
high
the world,
levels.
and there's also quite high levels of meat consumption in Hong Kong as well, which would almost go against what most people would consider as part of a healthy lifestyle.
Yeah, and this is the reason why it's so difficult to really pinpoint what's right for the individual, because all these are population studies. And if you take one person, you know, for example, we know in very old studies, if we take somebody from an ancestral background that was Asian, and then we put them onto a Western type diet, that a lot of them would get heart disease and diabetes at a much higher rate. So then the question is it actually just the diet, or is it because they've moved in the air, in the water? You know, because then with different geographical locations, you've got different microbiomes.
Yeah.
So, you know, a lot of that also impacts us. So that's why it's not just looking at the macronutrients anymore, it's actually looking at the whole impact. And so, you know, even though we try to control everything in science so that we can understand the pathways, the reality is we don't live in these isolated pathways.
Yeah.
We actually, live in...
I think, it's quite, the whole nutritional science thing is quite interesting. One of my members, Dominic Rapson, he's big into ancestral nutrition, but he was he said one time, he was like, we're the only animals in the whole world that don't know what to eat. Like we don't even know what to consume, right? All these very simple animals are just, you know, eating what they're naturally built to eat, and we're just still trying to figure it out. And it almost seems like us being as smart as we are is kind of worked against us. And like even going to how bad health is in America right now, and I guess even in South Korea, from when I first started living there like 11 years ago, or now almost over 13 years ago, they had a lower obesity rate than Japan, they had the lowest obesity rate in all of the OECD. And then by the time I left after 11 years, they had increased. They were still quite low, but they had almost doubled. They went from like 3 or less than 3% obesity rate to almost I think it's close to 6 now, from in that span. Japan is still really low, even though they've increased a little bit, but I think there's definitely been a huge influence in Western food in South Korea. What's funny about South Korea too is like you go there, it's the fried chicken capital of the world. It's seriously, there's so many fried chicken places, and they love this concept. It's called chimek, which basically means chicken and beer, and they have all these chicken and beer locations, which is
that's overflowed into Hong Kong, because I started
the
seeing
chicken and beer
fried
thing?
chicken places, and I'm like, is this a Korean delicacy? I don't remember it being sort of a thing, but it's popping up in various places.
Yeah, so the fried chicken and beer thing is very popular. They recently started popularizing beer and pizza, so they call it PMEC. So so pizza, mek is short for mekju, which is beer. So they do this thing where they just like take the first syllable of the two words and they just put it together. And so yeah, chicken and beer is the most popular. Pizza and beer is starting to become more popular. They also have one of the highest liquor consumption rates in the world. They were like, I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, I looked, they were like number 1 in the world in liquor consumption, because they have their soju drink. It's so cheap.
And it's part of the culture.
Oh yeah, super part of the culture.
It's part of, you just can't drink it like water. I mean, it's like the Russians.
Yeah, but they also have a very preventative healthcare system, which has almost kind of worked against them, because they're so quick now to give their clients antibiotic shots. Like as soon as they feel like they're catching a cold, they go to see the doctor, and the doctor's right away is like antibiotic. And so now like Koreans have like such a great preventive care system, but now it's so preventative that they're just like overdosing on antibiotics. They're getting sick super easy. They have a saying called shukchi, which basically means like easy to get cold. And so they'll get sick like 3-4 times a year.
Wow.
Like quite often. So I think this whole I think they're trying to get away from it, but I find it's quite bad in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that. It's interesting to notice that, because I think I kind of look at places that are developing, and sort of my connection with that is because I was born in Burma, so it's now opened up into sort of the rest of the world for investment and trade, and so going back there, I've noticed, I went back there actually about 20 years ago, and then I've gone back a couple of times in the last 2 years.
Okay.
I've noticed that even the last 2 years, there's been a lot of fast food, and people there now are very, very slim, because they walk everywhere, they eat a traditional sort of Burmese diet, and then just seeing sort of these places open up, and people are going there because right now they're actually expensive. They're considered like gourmet.
The fast food places.
Yeah, the fast food places. So
okay.
they're considered gourmet. So not everyone's affording to be able to eat it, which in some ways I think it's probably a good thing. But then over time, as it becomes more available, more popular, and because there's that connection with the West, there's that sort of status. I think
I want to be more
are
American.
So.
I think people are starting to get away from that, right? They see America now, and they're just kind of like, I don't want to be like that anymore. Getting a little bit too extreme on the fat side,
I think
what's it like in Hong Kong now? Are people very health conscious in Hong Kong, or?
Actually, it's interesting because I think there is sort of a culture of people that are becoming much more aware of their health. Maybe because there's that underlying tradition in Chinese medicine where the idea is about supporting vitality, and some of my patients used to joke and said, I come to see you for the drugs, but then I go to see the TCM to get better. So I was like, what? But there's an underlying understanding about longevity, and so the concept of eating certain foods and what foods are important, because a lot of the TCMs, traditional Chinese medicine practitioners, will advise on eliminating certain foods from the diet. So it's kind of like an elimination diet.
I think the Chinese, though though there's not, I mean, a lot of Westerners would argue that there's just not a lot of like science behind like what the Chinese do, but the Chinese have been practicing what they do for so long, and though people would argue against like anecdotal evidence, what is a case study but like a large,
Yeah.
amount of anecdotal situations, right? But they just like they isolate the variables as much as possible. But I find that, I mean, there's so many things that work in Chinese medicine that, I mean, they're so much further ahead, I think, than what Westerners are doing. I think part of it to the Westerners' hindrance is maybe the over reliance on absolute like truth or absolute fact on certain things before experimenting.
Yeah, well, I think partly that came from the fact that, we just started developing a lot of therapeutics, like drugs, medication, for example, that do have serious side effects. So the idea that we have to look at these things very carefully came about, and so the level of evidence for these types of treatments, because they're potentially very toxic, have to be very high. So that's why the idea that everything else has to fall under that category is a little bit of a blanket statement. So when you say, well, there's evidence from 3,000 years ago, because they're actually recorded in Chinese text. It's just not on PubMed for you to research and read. And it is in Chinese language, so people aren't getting access to it.
Yeah, that's a funny thing. Like, people would just be like, oh, I can't find it on, let's say, PubMed or exam.com. And it's like, well, it's probably in text that you just can't read. Like there's a lot, there's a lot of things with regards to exercise and nutrition, or not, I don't know about nutrition, but definitely about exercise or physical health that comes from Germany. And they have a ton of material. The issue for someone like me who can't read German is that I have to wait for it to get translated by somebody. And then also, too, is like, well, maybe it'll never get translated. And there's always going to be like information from like super high level performers or practitioners or whatnot that are not, it's not known to the public or even known to other high level practitioners from the West. And then sometimes there's also situations like in, let's say, the Olympics, like if there's like a Olympic coach from China that has like the most amazing methodology that gets him the gold every year, why would he share it to anybody, really? Especially the competition in that regards. So yeah, I think people need to be more open to other.
It's also about understanding what level of evidence is required for what specific therapies you're trying to sort of advise or recommend, because I always use a very simple principle. I look at it to see what the safety is, and I look at what the efficacy is, and is it simple to do, and is it actually something which is common sense? Because if the evidence for all of those ticks all those 4 boxes and it's pretty safe, then why not give it a go? And apart from that, a lot of the modern science research is actually discovering that a lot of the truths, or a lot of the practices in very traditional diets and medicine has a physiological basis and foundation. We're just finding and discovering those pathways now. So just because there's no evidence doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It's just that nobody's done the research. So we have to sort of be quite specific about what we mean by no evidence, because it could confuse people.
Well, even when there is case studies or evidence, some of it is not even interpreted correctly. Some of it's they'll come to a conclusion based off of unrealistic situations. So I think there was one study that was done on bacteria, where they basically isolated like one bacteria and then kind of like just dumped a bunch of artificial sweeteners on it. It's like you would have to consume like 200 times the normal recommended amount of this vitamin, and I mean, if you consume that much of anything, it'll kill you. So
it's not valid.
It's weird. Yeah, it's not valid.
It's
it's just like, I was like, oh, you shouldn't have artificial sweeteners because they just dumped 200 times the normal serving and it died. Well, of course it died.
Yeah, of course, because it's any type of anything, even good or bad. If you give too much, it's going to be poison.
Yeah.
So, and that's the thing about this obsession, and it becomes, and the whole thing about research is that if you look at a lot of the research too, well, who are they funded by?
Yeah, definitely
Yeah.
something. But even that, like saying just like it doesn't necessarily like like you can't just dismiss the results of the study because of who it's funded by, but at least that is a component that you should look
Yeah.
at and see if maybe some of the information was skewed a little bit with regards to who funded it. There was the big problem with the Harvard scientist that had that study on sugar,
Yeah.
right? That was like debunked because they
Yeah.
just messed up all the information.
Yeah,
and-
you have to be very careful in interpreting the data, and you've got to understand that there are components, perhaps, of incentives behind the results. And I think that's why, even though we say, oh yeah, this is gold standard, or this is what you should look at, I would always look at it with a grain of salt and say, is this relevant? Does it apply to the type of people that I'm trying to use it on? Or yeah.
I think, like when it comes to, let's say something as serious like this cancer, right? There's a lot of people in Western medicine that would just like they have a set protocol they would like force you to do, like chemotherapy and like all the other things. And then when somebody, I always hear like these stories of like someone tried maybe an alternative means to treat their cancer, and then they happen to eventually die. But it's weird that people's perception is that like, oh, he died because he did this alternative medicine, but they don't. It's like, well, even if he did chemo, he would have died, anyways. It's like it seems like they're almost blind to, if they would have just done chemo and done the Western style of treating the issue, that whether they lived or died, they almost dismiss it as it's like, oh, he was just going to die anyways. But if they did alternative medicine and they died, they'd be like, well, he should have done the chemo. Do you find a lot of people doing more alternative procedures with regards to something like cancer?
I think people are lost when it comes to having a diagnosis of cancer. It's often they're very afraid, they're very fearful, and there are very specific set of criterias and procedures that doctors go through to provide this medication. But yet at the same time, there's often not a lot of talk about things like nutrition, things like stress management, and even movement to some extent. And there are so many studies coming out now that say that part is just as important because it improves the tolerance to the actual therapies, which are often quite toxic.
Yeah, and there was there was a Tim Ferriss podcast where he actually, or I don't even know if it was a podcast, maybe it was just a blog post, but he talked to a bunch of nutritionists and a bunch of people from different specialties about what would they do if they found out that they had cancer. And there was like some commonalities with regard, and one of them was always like they had one component was definitely by far like nutrition, and quite a few of them would just go full on keto or definitely take out all like sugary products, because the research tends to lean towards that sugar feeds the cancer, right? And and it seems like a lot of them too like wouldn't. I'm not saying that you should not do chemo, but it seems like there's actually a big movement moving away from that kind of treatment. It seems to be quite harsh on that because it kills both
the
good and the bad.
Yeah.
So it almost seems like it's working against you in that regard, right?
Well, I think we have to understand that there are potential toxicities when we give medication. And whether it's chemotherapy or whether it's an antibiotic or whether it's an acid suppressant drug, the fine print tells us that there are all these side effects, but we don't know, or conventional medicine doesn't really address the area of how do we support that,
right.
How do we minimize it, and so people are seeking what we call alternative. But alternative, what does that mean? That means sort of something instead of convention, because that's sort of what it seems to imply. But I kind of like to use the term complementary, because complementary with the best evidence suggests that you're not excluding conventional chemo treatment, but you're doing that in conjunction with what is the best evidence for things like diet, nutrition, supplementation, and more research, for example, using intravenous vitamin C actually has shown to improve quality of life in patients who are receiving chemotherapy. So it's about looking at the evidence for that and not disregarding it and saying that's alternative. It's not a replacement for conventional treatment, but it can be done in conjunction with it.
Right.
So I think we have to start to understand what we mean before we use these terms. And coming from a science background, I like definitions. I like things to be transparent, and that's what I would sort of try to sort of really segregate and try to differentiate actually what people are meaning by alternative.
Yeah.
You know, do you mean instead of, or do you mean in conjunction with, or what do you really mean?
Yeah, I think,
you know?
yeah, even the word, right, alternative kind of has a negative kind of feeling towards it. Like people just, think of alternative as something. I mean, I don't know if it's definitely getting better. I mean, maybe it's just being here in Bali because there's just so many people doing alternative medicine or procedures or protocols or experimenting with things that I've never, never really had access to at all. I mean, we think about like the ozone treatment that people are doing. Has there been anything interesting that you've tried recently that people normally wouldn't do or don't really relatively have access to, like while here in Bali?
Yeah, I guess in terms of watsu, but that's sort of more of a gentle type of treatment.
What is that again?
So it's like shiatsu. So it's a Japanese form of massage. It's
Okay.
very, very gentle.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been shown to improve the parasympathetic nervous system. So it's basically this form of shiatsu, but done in a pool,
Okay.
in water with a therapist. And
It's like getting a baptism.
So it's not so much a dunk and a come up, but
yeah.
it's about 75 minutes.
Okay.
And the therapist actually helps you
So your
to
full
move
body's
your
in the
body.
water?
Yeah, full
Okay.
body's in the water. You're floating. You've got some things to help you float. Like you're like myself, who's like a little bit dense in their body. That needs sort of like a floaty. And so the therapist and you try and just let go.
Yeah.
So let go, and the therapist will move your body around into different positions. And the idea is that when I first experienced shiatsu, it actually made me feel very, very calm. I just immediately felt that I was less sympathetic, I was much calmer, and it actually helped me tap into my creative problem-solving side.
Okay.
So I was curious about trying this because, I resonated really well with shiatsu. So I thought, what about in water? What would that be like? And it was a very similar feeling or sensation that I had, because I was starting to get ideas about how to solve different problems in my life that just kind of came up, and it was a journey for me. It was actually, it was very, very emotional, but also very personal. There were different lessons that I learned about myself through that process. So I think they're not necessarily new. I think there are different modalities that help bring people to that space. For example, like sound therapy.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you've done sound or light therapy.
Yeah, actually I did that all here this month that I was here in Bali. Was one of the reasons why I came.
Yeah,
was
I think
to experience
that's a really kind of cool part about coming to Bali with regards to, and I think this kind of all falls into the industry that we're in with regards to wellness is, for me particularly being here in Bali, is wellness tourism. And I think there's a lot of ability to experiment with a lot of different protocols and procedures and such in Bali wouldn't necessarily be readily available in other areas.
Yeah.
I haven't tried the sound and the light therapy, but I'm definitely interested in getting on that. Have you tried the sensory deprivation tank, the float tanks?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you talked about the floating part of the shiatsu massage, like I think I did it for the first time. I spent like 90 minutes in there, and it was, man, like after 60 minutes, I felt like exhausted. I was exhausted just laying there and mentally fatigued, I guess.
What was going through your mind? Was there anything?
I don't know. I was just like, why am I, like, this is so long. Why am I just in here for so long? I don't know. I was just kind of like, my mind was empty for the most part. I tried to sleep, but I think maybe I came in and out.
Yeah.
But I didn't really have, maybe I need a few more sessions, but I didn't really have like a revelation or
and I
like
have
that.
to admit that when I first went into that type of tank, that was the question I was asking. It's like, why did I decide to come here?
Yeah, what is this? What's going on? Like, I'm just like floating here and just.
What am I supposed to feel? And all these things and thoughts were going through my head, and I almost felt like, you know, the first session I really disliked it, and I said I would never go back again. But it was after a little while that I did a bit more work in terms of breathing.
Okay.
So it was like doing breath work, and that's when I started to have a sense of connection with myself. And I think when we're in wellness, you know, I was, you know, many years back, I was more focused on the physical aspect of wellness.
Yeah.
I didn't actually sort of understand the connection between wellness in my mind. So it wasn't just mental wellness. So it wasn't just that, oh, you know, I don't want anxiety, depression, or sort of these things, but it was more about, you know, my mental state overall, you know, the stress that I carry every day. You know, how do I understand and how do I deal with those things? Because and I started looking into how to bring that consciousness of these emotions that I would have, but I would ignore, because we're all kind of unconscious or subconscious in many ways when we're like living our day to day, and we're reacting to things, you know, just like our limbic system goes into overdrive.
Fire all the time.
And you're on the phone all the time, you're getting emails, you're getting questions all the time. So and I would find myself just having this sense of overwhelm and burnout. And so my journey was to try to understand a bit more about, what if I just didn't do anything?
But I find that too, like with regards to, definitely there's a higher focus on the mental aspect of health, I think, in Bali compared to other places. I do also find that there's issues with regards to fitness and how people approach it. You know, like, sure, people think of the physical aspect of fitness, but it tends, most of the industry is either you focus on the aesthetics, right, how you look and you know how smaller clothes you fit into, or it's just a kind of a fatigue-seeking nature, right? It's not really figuring out what it is your body needs. It's just like, just put yourself in a situation where you're just like destroying your body and see if you can survive. And one of my members here now, she's her name's Nettie. She's like a mobility specialist, and so essentially she pretty much every day she starts off by essentially doing like a self-exploration of her body and just figuring out where she is like extra, maybe she's like extra tight in a certain area, like her hips, and then she'll like figure out what is it that her body needs before actually figuring out like what is she going to be training for that day. And I think there's a few mobility guys that have been coming through, and really when it comes to like longevity, we want to think about our joints is like one of the biggest things, and can you maintain like full range of movement through the rest of your life? And so I mean, it's not sexy. That's for sure.
Yeah,
like
and you're
gonna
right.
spend like half an hour just like, I'm just gonna work on my hip mobility. You know, it's not as sexy as doing like 500 burpees and whatnot. But
and it's not Instagrammable because
not so much. Yeah, not so much. But some of the stuff they're doing is quite intense, and it's almost unbelievable. I think, but it all kind of falls around this idea of like, how do you redefine like what is normal functionality of the body?
Well, if you look at how, you know, humans have evolved from a baby, you know, into midlife. I mean, if you look at a baby, they do a perfect squat.
Yeah, and super flexible, and relative to, and you see little kids, right? Little kids are generally, relative to their size, are quite strong.
Yeah.
We tend to get tighter, less flexible. Sure, like an absolute way, like we're stronger, but relative to the size that we are, like not really. We had a kid in here. She was like 8-9 years old, and she was like doing crazy things. Like, I just couldn't believe, like, she's like doing high level, like, advanced movements, like in calisthenics. And or even like we have an 85-year-old who comes in once a week, and he's doing mobility exercises that a lot of people in their 20s and 30s can't do. I think it's just like having a different focus on the training.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is the part where you say, you're quite right, that it's not sexy, because they're really basic things. And people sort of get bored, or they don't get motivated to continue with those things. And this is the sort of struggle that I have with all the basic things that I try and get my patients to do. But I think people come here and they see that it's available, and it brings their attention and awareness to it in their classes, in their regular coaches.
There's definitely a tipping point coming. Like, there's something coming with regards to like how much people are like destroying their bodies through most avenues of fitness. You know, even like bodybuilding, right? Like, how many people are dying at a younger age because of how massive they get, and how many problems they have with regards to their organ function. And then also like in your fatigue seeking nature with regards to a lot of these gyms is like, you know, you have shoulder problems, you have hip problems, and all these just general health issues. So especially with the world like aging population too, it makes a lot of sense if someone wants to get into it, like go into personal training for the elderly. Like, I think that's a massively growing industry.
It's huge, because for example, like I remember watching my grandmother, who lived till 90, and up until the age of 80, she was able to, you know, sit on a very low squat chair and just do her little vegetable sort of preparation before cooking her food. And she was mobile, she was very independent. I walk through the park in Hong Kong and I see these old people doing their Tai Chi, and they're in a community. And I kind of then think back to when I was in Australia, you know, medical school, and I wasn't seeing that. So I think there's definitely, because the world is getting closer and closer, there's a lot more of these types of movements and traditions that are really being exchanged. So I do see that people are picking up on that. And so I think people also are being more aware that it's not just the fancy stuff. You know, it's the same with what I do in anti-aging. It's not just the fancy tools, but you've also got to work on the foundation thing. So for me, it's a team of people around me, my health coaches and my nurse and therapists who are there to actually hold people's hand, and just to motivate and encourage them for the long term.
Do you ever get anybody, like, if you gave them like a very simple basic thing that they need to work on, like maybe they get like angry or even get confused as to what exactly, like they're almost expecting something like amazing that they just they're like, really, all I have to do is sleep? This is I can't believe I had to come all the way here just to get some advice to sleep more.
To pay me all this money to just tell them to sleep more. I guess I don't just tell them what they need to do, I actually educate them, because I try and understand where they're coming from. We have a very comprehensive questionnaire. We do sort of, and I look at what is the connection between all these symptoms. So, and I often offer them the alternate, the different types of modalities. I can say, well, I could give you this pill, and you would sleep, but the thing is, you're not going to get deep sleep, which is what you really need to heal your body.
Right.
So, you know, you choose what you want. So
I think, that's definitely a good thing. I like how you answered that. You know, like, there's so many people that would just, you're actually trying to figure out like what's going on with these people and educating them, which I think is a big part of the process. You know, not just saying, all right, I'm going to fix you, and then you fix them and you're like, all right, good. Like, I mean, because what ends up happening with a lot of people, especially from the physical component, is that like, even if you were to fix them, it's like you can expect them back in 2 weeks, because they're gonna hurt themselves again, or they just don't even know like what they did. But this is also quite interesting. It reminds me of when you're saying you give them both options, right? Whether they can actually do something to fix the real underlying issue, or just take a pill and feel better. And there was like a photo or a meme or something where like one person was like offered, he can either eat some liver
Mhm.
to get a bunch of like all these nutrients and get
Yeah.
all this stuff that they wanted,
Yeah.
or they just take like, I don't know,
15
like
different
crazy,
capsules
yeah,
or
15 different
pills or
capsules or pills or whatever, and
Yeah.
just take these pills and you'll feel good. And it's like, well, I'll just take the pills. And so how do you find any difficulty with people who they will understand that they have a problem, they understand that they would get certain benefits from doing it maybe more holistically, but still decide to go with the pills? Like,
Yeah, sure. And that's, that's part of their journey. And I don't see myself as doing anything for them. Ultimately, any type of change that someone makes that's sustainable for long term has to come from themselves. So I can't really force them to change. I can just educate them,
provide them with
options. With the options,
yeah.
so that perhaps at some stage down the line they're ready to make that decision.
Yeah.
And I think that's really part of patient-centered care. It's about understanding, empowering your patients, empowering the people so that they have the right information. And if they're ready to make that change, then have the right tools and the right support system for them to go and make that change and be successful with it.
Yeah, timing is such a huge component. Unfortunately, some people, maybe they wait too late. So we always think of like for the physical component, like sometimes it takes some kind of trauma experience, like they hurt their shoulder and then they're like, wow, I gotta really focus on my shoulders. Ideally, you don't get to a point where you wake up one day with herniated disc in your back or something that's like really debilitating before you're like, man, now I gotta focus on my health. But I do think it's kind of there's that one part where they do end up realizing after some very hard experience that they need to change their focus.
Yep.
But then there's also people who would experience a very hard situation and then basically just give up, right? And they'll just be like, oh, well, I'm already, I've already been smoking for 20 years, so what does it matter if I stop now? Are there any like psychological aspects of what you do, like with regards to helping people kind of deal with these issues?
Yeah, there's a huge, eventually everything comes down to that. It's the mindset and where that mental state is. Because if someone believes that they are going to recover, that they have the ability to feel better, then they are going to be more motivated, for sure. But if someone is in a bad place where they feel that health and wellness is something that they don't deserve, then they're not going to make those changes because they actually don't feel that they deserve to be in a better place. So part of the process for me is also to understand what pressures they have in their life, how do they see themselves. So it's not a really formal test that I do, but through the conversation, I'm listening to them and trying to understand where their mindset is and where they come from.
So the more emotional intelligence component of...
Yeah, exactly, totally. And so, it's about assessing where they're at, because if they have a very high, if they're very well developed, they've done a lot of work on themselves to explore that avenue, they get it, they understand, and they are on the same page. But sometimes they're not, and they're not even aware that they're not in that space. So then it's about bringing that attention and focus without being threatening and challenging, because sometimes we can put symptoms down into something that's all just in your head. Psychosomatic, go and see a psychiatrist, get an antidepressant, and most people actually don't need that, but they just need a little bit of education, a bit of positive psychology, and I use that a lot in my conversations with my patients. Even like sometimes they'll come back and say, look, of all the things that you told me to do, I only managed to do that, and they just feel very self-defeated. And I said, wow, that's great. You actually did one thing. And how do you feel about that? And just focus on the positives of that. So I don't do formal psychotherapy or those things, and I refer out to people who really need it, and I have a very good colleague who's an integrative psychiatrist.
Okay.
So she's someone that I hope
That'd
eventually
be really
you'll be able
cool.
to talk to, because she's got a lot of interesting talks about that. So there are different levels, and my job is to assess how severe people's emotional states are, and then refer them to the right people, and just bring awareness and attention to that.
Yeah. No, that's real cool. Yeah, definitely I mean, we see it with in a lot of athletes as well, right? I mean, sports psychology is a huge,
Yeah.
huge field,
Hmm.
and there's just so many. Um, yeah, the mindset thing is massive.
Mm.
Do you ever? And I find there's like another component that I was like wanting to ask about with regards to people in this day and age where there's just so much information available on the internet, right? Do you ever have people that would come in too to be like, oh, I read this on what's the big WebMD or something like
Yeah,
that? Yeah, like I
WebMD.
read this on WebMD.
Yeah, yeah.
I must have this problem with me, like, or
Yep.
they'll almost not even like listen to what your suggestions might be. But I do like that you're focused on the educational component, right, and providing people with options. So giving them the actual,
Mm.
like, if you give them, you know, choices A, B, and C, and C happens to be the worst decision, but you gave them the choice and they chose it, then you kind of have to own it to a certain extent.
Mhm.
Uh, but
Yeah.
uh, but I definitely like that approach significantly more than almost forcing decisions on people.
Yeah, it's kind of always been my approach because it's about empowering people, and I think as a doctor, I mean the real ancient definition of a doctor is a teacher.
Mm.
We're there to teach people about their bodies, about their health and wellness, and yeah, sure we have all these tools, you know, drugs, medication, you know, whatever it is. That we use, but there are tools, and people ultimately still have to take responsibility for their decision.
Mm.
You know, whether I agree or not, you know, on a personal level, it's not about me, it's about that person. And going back to what you say, people read all sorts of stuff on the internet and they get analysis paralysis and they come in even more confused. And so I usually will draw their attention back to themselves and their symptoms and why they came in and what triggered it and what's most likely to be the issue there, and then get them to actually start with that first step first, because the body is connected.
Yeah.
If you actually make a change that's positive, that's supporting the system, then it will shift other parts of the body. And classic example is someone comes in with a skin problem and I do something with their diet and gut and their joint pains get better. So, you know, they may diagnose themselves with fibromyalgia, for example, when they look on
Yeah.
WebMD, but it's actually not really as severe as that because, you know, they're not trained to assess the level of severity.
Right.
You know, we are as clinicians, and so it's our job to give them an idea of, you know, where they sit, you know, in the, I call it the traffic light system. Are you green? Are you yellow? Are you red? Because
Yeah.
if you're red, you're in serious condition. You need to do something about it now.
Yeah.
So it's about measuring their symptoms and telling them, well, actually, a lot of people feel that way as well, and most people have these experiences. It's actually
Yeah.
not that bad. It just takes a bit of time, you know, or this is very serious. You know, this is very high. We need to do something about it now.
Mm.
You have to have further investigation. So it's a kind of triage as well, so that we're not putting fear into people to get them to take action.
Right.
You know, you're not over exaggerating their symptoms or the severity of it and what it means to get them to do something, because, you know, I don't really feel that this fear mindset is something that is going to help people, because when we're in fear, we're only looking at the negatives.
Mm.
We're much more, because our brains are wired that way, to just focus on the negatives. What pain I'm in, what can't I do, what can't I achieve. Whereas if we actually just give the right information,
Mm.
and it helps to sort of balance their expectations and what they need to do, they're also in a much better space to receive information that I'm trying to teach them.
True. Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, definitely the focus on health is increasing a lot with regards to like the health, like the wellness tourism industry. It's, I mean, it's one of the, I mean, I think it is the fastest growing sector of tourism. And that's, I mean, kind of one of the big reasons why we kind of set up shop here in Bali. And you can see all the other alternative medicine, all the scientists, all the practical, like, practitioners
Yeah.
and whatnot. But I think, yeah, it's a very cool, interesting scene to be here in Bali and meet someone like yourself. And it will be definitely cool to have more discussions. And I definitely really appreciate like the way that you think about how to deal with like people's health as opposed to just putting a band-aid on the situation. It's very it's very hard to find, like in anything health related, right? Whether it be fitness and that's a big thing that we focus on, not just obviously for this podcast, of the idea of how can we have optimal health, beyond just surviving life, but how can we thrive to become the best version of ourselves? And then that's, I mean, for us, we focus, obviously more on the physical component, but we're trying to incorporate more of the recovery protocols, trying to get more educational events, right, happening at the gym as well. I think that's a very interesting part of what we do that's not at most gyms, right? So most gyms are just gym, and most gyms are just like, okay, you either survive this 60-minute workout, or you work on bigger biceps, and like that's it. So yeah, definitely it's been an interesting process to get people to actually understand like the movement component of their body, and trying to connect their brain, their CNS, using their CNS to actually engage their muscles, or even teaching someone how to use their quads. Because it's crazy, because like you get some people, and it tends to be people who are super flexible, but cannot even engage their thighs properly, because they actually have no. Well, one, they're really limited in how much muscle they have, but also two, they just like they've never squeezed their quads before, or something like that. Like it's very.
Have a problem there.
Or even scapula development, like that's a big, and you actually find there's a huge disconnect with so-called fitness professionals as well. Like this is one thing I wanted to ask with regards to other people who are into anti-aging or into other health fields, but this idea of competency, right? Like there are some people that have maybe they look on WebMD, but maybe a little bit higher than that. Do you ever find that there's other like professionals in the field that maybe don't have as much understanding of the overall picture of understanding of the material than what they kind of give out? Because like I do find maybe it's more prevalent just in the fitness industry, because the barrier to entry is so low, right? Like you could be like 20 years old, you can get a personal training certification, and then boom, you feel like you know everything. Science and what you do, there's obviously a much more in-depth process, so it's probably not as prevalent, but
it's less prevalent because we have so many strict criteria in medical school, and that's quite rigorous, and the kind of people that end up going into it, coming out of it, we're very, very meticulous, because we are using dangerous tools. They're prescription drugs, they have side effects, so we have to be meticulous. And I think so we have to make sure that we have that level of standard, and we are governed externally by a medical body, the medical license, registration system. Maybe it's more than relevant to, so we were saying before how like you don't have a very specific focus on the psychological aspect of what your patients might need, and you would refer them out to a specialist. Maybe it's more with regards to like general practitioners that go beyond the scope of what their knowledge is, and recommend things that so like a general practitioner has no background in nutrition, start giving a lot of nutritional advice on what people should do. Like I find that that's quite more common than it should be. I think that there's definitely some situations where like someone who is like, it's like someone who specializes in like ear, nose, and throat start giving advice on heart health. Like it, it's just sometimes there's like maybe there's certain things that they shouldn't be just because they're a doctor, but sometimes they're so specific in one area that they shouldn't be. They should know where their limitations are with regards to their field. I actually find, I don't know, maybe it's a different set of people, but I actually find that the more specialized you are, the more you actually stay within your realm. But when it comes to nutrition, however, the problem is that doctors are not taught nutrition. So we only
it's like one course
hour.
Some super
some people might get a day, but we're really not given much information on that. So a lot of the information that is given is quite generic and very non-specific. So, but nutrition itself is quite specific to the person, where they're at and what their metabolism is. But because there's not enough information there, we're kind of just giving really what is generic out there. So that can be perceived as, for the patient, maybe it's inappropriate. But because it is accepted as standard of care, it's kind of that's the advice that's given. So it's because they don't know, and they haven't necessarily done the further training, or they haven't sort of felt that they need to, because anything that you do after medical school or your specialty training is kind of not essential, because all that training is really geared towards drug prescription. It's only now, I have to say this, and how much time did we spend on, okay, what is exercise prescription?
Right.
What is, sleep prescription? Like, this is very new, and the American Board of Lifestyle Medicine was only recently established to address these issues. That as doctors, apart from drug prescriptions, we should be able to prescribe lifestyle prescriptions.
Yeah.
Because most patients do come to listen to their doctor for some reason. We're still seen in high esteem in Asia.
Yeah.
And so it's more powerful what I say to the patient. If I say, well, you need to have 8 hours of good quality deep sleep, they'll actually do it because they still feel that, the doctor knows best.
Do you think then there's like maybe some of the problem is that because there's certain areas with regards to like let's say lifestyle and sleep, that it's difficult for a doctor to have a specialist that they can refer patients to?
Because there isn't one person who says, I look after this person's sleep, and I keep them accountable. Because actually, to do that, you kind of need health coaches, because the doctor's time is just not effective in monitoring and policing that. I say police, but actually it should really be supported. Yeah. But what I mean is, it's like when you hire a personal trainer. You go there twice a week, and you talk about your training. They see you, they check in with you. The same with a health coach. You have specific goals that you want to meet, whether it's, for example, one of my nurses the other day said, I want to be able to do 5,000 steps per day. And so, great, okay, so I actually got the other health coach in the practice to say, now you're going to be responsible for coaching her and making sure that she's doing her 5,000 steps. And now we have these wearables, we have Apple Watches, we have technology that do these simple things. I mean, I just feel that there is no excuse not to write it as a prescription and get people to slowly move more. And that's why, as a doctor, I need help from health coaches, because they're working together with me. They understand the goals of my patient, and the patient almost like has a contract with a health coach, and they know they're going to check in once a week, and they know they're going to see on the graph. We have a health coach app, so the patients download it. Yeah. They connect it to their device, and we see what they do.
Yeah, I definitely think though that there's definitely a disconnect between like what scientists are doing with regards to like health, and then sometimes, like, let's say if they don't necessarily know, like they would just say, all right, you need to exercise 3 days a week, and it's like, well, what does that mean? Like, like for me, it's like, if you just mean exercise, well, there's just so many things you could be doing, and actually some forms of exercise could be detrimental to what you actually want to accomplish. So it's but I definitely think like building a network of practitioners that can help refer patients and work together to help optimize the situation, because I mean it's almost, I mean, it's impossible for one person to know enough about everything to provide the most perfect program. But I think because we're still in such a exploratory phase of all these different areas, that there needs to be a lot more communication between high level fitness experts, scientists and anti-aging and just practitioners, just all these different fields that come together and actually talk. Which actually, and I hope you can come for in October 12th, which would be we're going to hold a wellness conference, which ideally we get a lot of people from different backgrounds, and not just, we'll have a health lifestyle coach and and someone talking about ancestral nutrition, and hopefully yourself talking about anti-aging and regenerative medicine, and maybe we get somebody to come in and talk about the psychological aspect of
Yeah.
and sleep, and just have everybody come in and just, I think that'd be really
Yeah.
quite cool and quite interesting.
Yeah.
So where can everybody find you on social media?
Yeah,
And
so you can find me on social media, Instagram at Doc Laurena, or you can find me on Facebook at Dr. Laurena,
okay.
or you can find me on my website at www.drlaurena.com, and
Okay.
it's Laurena.
Okay, and all that we'll go ahead and post into the comments section below the podcast. This was awesome, yeah, and I
Thank
know
you.
you're
Yeah, that's
you're leaving
great.
tomorrow back to Hong Kong, but you'll be back soon, and I'm sure we'll have some more talks in the future.
Yeah, look forward to it. Thank you
Okay,
so much,
awesome.
Ian. Thank you.
Well, thank you for tuning in on another episode of Nirvana Strength Practitioners panel, and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.